From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Welcome to Part 2 of Every Photo is a Story. I'm Kristi Finefield, reference librarian in the Prints and Photographs Division at the Library of Congress. Historian Sam Watters and I are going to talk about the photographer Frances Benjamin Johnston and find out how her interests and goals shaped the pictures we're learning to read. So Sam, who was FBJ, as we sometimes familiarly call her, Frances Benjamin Johnston? What did you learn while researching your book?
Well, Frances Benjamin Johnston was born 1 year before the end of the Civil War.
Oh, wow.
And she was, came of age in a period where women were able to, of a certain class and wealth, were able to enter the workforce professionally. And she at first chose to become an educated artist, studying in Paris, which was a great prestigious opportunity for a young woman of that period.
Sure.
And she came back to Washington and continued her art studies, and then she decided that she really was better suited to become a professional photographer. Photography was on the rise in this period. There was an ability increasingly to print photographs in newspapers and books, and she rode that wave. And she did that throughout her career, where she successfully progressed as the culture evolved for use of photographs. She began as a photojournalist in Washington, and she took photographs of schools, of the Hampton Institute, of the White House, embassies. And as that field broadened for progressive political reportage, she then moved into a professional portrait photography. People, of course, just like this era, they became absolutely fascinated by celebrity. This was the rise of a kind of celebrity. Well, it's the beginning of that kind of media interest. And she opened up a studio in the back of her house in Washington, D.C., where she lived with her parents, and she photographed many notable people, including Booker T. Washington. She photographed Theodore Roosevelt, who became a friend of hers.
And before he was president?
Just before he was president and during his presidency.
Wow.
She was the an official, or so she called it, photographer of 3 presidents. And she was very friendly with many of the literary and artistic figures at the time, a great friend of Alice Longworth Roosevelt. And,
so she moved in many circles.
Yes, she did.
Okay.
And she then moved, when that field became crowded with photographers, she then moved to New York and capitalized on the rise of the City Beautiful movement, which began in Chicago, which in the famous Chicago Exposition of 1893, which she photographed. And she moved as New York, which was a center of so much wealth and culture, began to build the New York Public Library, which she photographed. The Metropolitan Museum it comes into power in this period. And she also then moved logically into the photographing of the wealthy patrons of these museums, including Arthur Curtis and Harriet James. So that's how likely she met the Jameses, and when you study her, you are able to piece together those kind of progressive growth of her own career.
So she photographed their home in New York before she ever went to Beacon Hill.
Right.
Or went to
Well, that's what we assume.
Or we think.
We certainly know that the first time she photographs Beacon Hill is in 1914, and the photographs in New York are of an earlier period.
So this is when she became a garden photographer. This is the phase of her career we've entered.
That's right.
So she's not a young woman anymore at this point.
Right. So she's now 50, and the rise of houses brought gardens. And the rise of the garden movement in America, we can mark to the founding of the Garden Club of America in 1913. And I believe that that's, in fact, when Johnston really becomes professionally engaged seriously in the photographing of private gardens and estates.
So she saw it as the next thing to do.
She
it's
absolutely,
part of the City Beautiful movement, but it's
the photographing of architecture became a field which was many professional architectural photographers, and gardening was seen as the domain of women. So this was a perfect field for her as a woman photographer to move into in this period of, let's say, 1913. And she traveled all and up and down the East Coast to the southern states. She photographed somewhat in the Midwest, but was very progressive and inventive in her going to California to photograph gardens.
Wow.
The first garden photographs we know of serious were taken in an estate in Northern California in 1907.
Wow, so she covered.
So
covered
she went back in
country,
1917,
East Coast, West Coast.
1923, and she went back, and then she went to Europe for a very long extended stay and added European photographs to her collection.
Wow, so you really got to know Frances Benjamin Johnston in your research. As part of your researching photographs, you had to get to know her, too.
Probably more than she wanted me to know.
That's kind of a private woman, it turned out.
Well,
that makes the challenge.
I think everybody's private until they want to be famous, in which case she wanted to be famous, and here she is. Right.
So what are some of the ways you learned all that information you just told me? What would be an example of ways that a researcher could pursue that kind of knowledge?
Well, the first easy place and the direct place to start is to find biographies of any artist or a creative person.
So if you're lucky enough that people have written about her,
that's right, and there are several fine
read.
Books on the subject, a general subject of Johnston's whole life. You are fortunate in the case of Johnston to have a manuscript collection, her own collection of papers, which is here in the Library of Congress, and that affords a particularly intimate window into her own life.
What kind of things are in a manuscript collection?
Well, you hope.
Or at least in hers.
Well, but you always hope, and there are always parts, and some manuscript collections are more complete than others. I think that we would all agree, those of us who've studied Johnston, that Johnston, it's on the scale of 1 to 10, it's a 7.
Oh, okay.
But
There's some holes.
There are some holes, which you always have to imagine. Did she leave the holes intentionally, or were they just the loss of materials?
So you're reading her letters.
You're reading her letters, diaries,
records maybe.
Business records, bills, shopping. There are bills from Wanamaker's in Philadelphia for hats. There are her documents recording what photographs she took, people she knew. She has a wonderful address book where if you look very carefully, you can begin to see that she had she had what we used to say, a really big Rolodex filled with very powerful
important to have
contacts people. Right.
Okay, so that was, I'm sure all of that kind of information played into understanding more of her archive, the kind of things you read in her manuscripts.
Yes, I mean, that was a map. It gave you, also it gives you something very important, which is a chronology, because these things, if you, hopefully the archive has been dated and she left dates, and that gives you a real sense of how her life flowed.
So what's another way we could learn about her would be to look at her photographs, right?
Yes, but as we saw in the earlier video, there are files and boxes full of Frances Benjamin Johnston photographs, but you should never stop just with one artist's work. You should always consider the work of other people who might have photographed the same subject, because
so we'll give an example of what you can learn from that kind of search.
I think you have here. This is a really interesting and key photograph. Why don't we look at both of them together?
Okay.
So they're
very similar.
If you look at these, it is the same view, but there's been a major change in the garden. We don't know. From looking at this, we don't know if this change, which one happened in what order.
Okay, because it's the same pools.
Same pools,
mostly.
But what's different is the structure in the back, which is a pergola, is radically different between one photograph and the next.
Yes, it is.
But I think not just the specifics of certain elements in the garden are important to keep in when you look at a photograph or any subject you're looking at, but always remember that when you look at somebody else's view of a photograph and what they might have seen in a garden or a house, tells you what another photographer like Johnston may have left out. What did she decide not to photograph? What did she think was important versus what somebody else was thinking?
So seeing another person's perspective teaches you
Always.
A little bit about
It's not just
each
the difference of what the fact is in the photograph, it also tells you what the photographer is thinking.
So another way to find out kind of what she was thinking would be to look at her library. And there were records that led you to the books that she owned herself, right?
Right. Well, so in her manuscript collection, you find, again, one of those difficult undertakings, which is that It's not as if she kept, here's my library, and methodically
not so organized as that.
It is very fractured, and it was a library that she accumulated over many years. She sold parts of it. She no doubt lost many parts because she traveled so much, and we know that she had warehouses where she would put all her belongings out of her New York apartment and put them in the warehouse. And what you can take away from this is that she read certain things, and that's very important in an era when there wasn't television.
So books
were the way that people became educated and shared ideas. And you can read those books and understand what she may have thought or known about her own time and period and what people were thinking.
And so speaking of publications, another way that you learned about her and that a person could learn about her is to look at publications of that time period where she might have, her photos might have appeared, she might have been written about, so you probably did a lot of that to learn about her.
That's right, because her professional life was dependent on being able to publish her photographs. So you have the double benefit of reading through newspapers and magazines of the period, because you will find not only her own work, but you'll find people commenting on those photographs. I mean, every photograph is published in a magazine, and they at least, at the very minimum, is a caption. So you might find out about the garden, but you may also find out what people thought about the garden. So it's a very rich experience to consider.
But time-consuming, I would imagine.
It's enormously time-consuming. The Library of Congress is exceptional in the completion of its periodical collection. So in many ways, this was a wonderful project to be doing with the library, because you really have in this National Library this extraordinarily deep collection of magazines and newspapers over a couple hundred years.
Yeah, and the beauty as well is that some of them are online. So there are people that can pursue them through online databases, maybe, or through digitized versions of those books.
Well,
so
it has
two ways
broadened
to approach
that
it.
experience. But many, you can never miss. You have to be very careful in periodicals, because never forget that the issue of Life magazine or Time magazine or the New York Times or the Washington Post, that day that you miss may be the day one of the most important photographs is published.
So you have to have patience to do good research.
And a lot of time.
Time and patience. Right. So now that we've talked a little bit about how you learn about the photographer, maybe we could talk a little about why. We've talked a little in the course of this, what are some of the benefits of learning about the photographer? But could you give me an example of when that kind of information has fed your knowledge of a photograph?
Well, let's go back to the photograph of the gardener that was so intriguing, that we find in this folder of the Blue Garden. And remember the back of that photograph?
Not much to go on there.
Not much.
Almost nothing.
I mean, well, first of all, we don't know whose handwriting this is.
Could be a library
That's
employee,
right. It could be a librarian. It could be somebody catalog it. We all make mistakes in this work. We start thinking it's one thing. It could be something else. Somebody puts a note down. They go back to it. And they don't go back to it. And you're left with, I thought it was the Blue Garden. Oh, but I'm wrong. It's Mrs. Smith's garden in New Jersey. So we have to always be distrusting of this. But in the case of this photograph, we were able to determine out of the manuscript archive and reading it that in fact she was in Newport 2 times in her life, and that she actually did photograph a series of the gardeners and the Blue Garden working, which we'll come back to as to what more we learned about that.
Okay, so a little bit of information gathered that way.
Right, but the two together, you have to look at the photograph and you have to read the manuscript archive.
And I think you mentioned that she went there twice. So none of these photographs in this folder appeared to have dates when we started. So you found this information that she went twice, and then you have a group of photos. So then you have to spend that time to figure out which one's first, what is the sequence here.
And you also, I should say, that the reason you know that she goes there twice is not only her manuscript archive, but also reading through newspapers of the time. And you want to find these references to her and her activities, because she was a social and famous photographer. And so she wasn't just printing her photographs, she was also being talked about in the newspapers. So she loved giving interviews. So it's always very helpful, and that's
media friendly.
That's how you find her in the knowing the Arthur Curtis James and his wife and being in Newport.
Okay, fantastic. So I think now we've talked a little bit about learning about the photographers, so let's do a little recap and cover our top tips. The top tips for learning about the photographer are to consult secondary reference sources, both printed and online, track down primary sources, such as the photographer's own publications or writings, magazine and newspaper articles from her lifetime, contemporary to her life. Establish a chronology of key dates and places to anchor the photographer within world events. We mentioned a chronology being important to find out what she was seeing, what was happening in the life, and to build a framework for when different kinds of photos were taken. These are general research skills, also useful for learning about any topic, the garden owners, like the Jameses, the history of the site, and many more types of topics. Please visit the Every Photo is a Story website for a list of key reference sources to locate biographical information about photographers, as well as another chance to try it yourself. Now let's move on to part 3 of the series and consider how the photos were made and why.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.